The smell reached you first. Leather and wool. Fresh paint and polished aluminum. And underneath it all, something you'd never encountered before. The particular scent of a flying ship. Persian rugs beneath your feet, thick enough to silence footsteps. White linen on the dining tables. Crystal glasses catching the morning light. And through the portholes, Lake Constance stretching between Switzerland and Germany, smooth as hammered silver. This was the Dornier Du X. 3 decks tall, 12 engines, large enough to carry 169 people into the sky. And inside, it felt like walking into a fine hotel. Let me take you aboard the most ambitious aircraft ever built and show you what it was like to dine, drink, and fly when aviation still believed it could be magnificent. Lake Constance, July 12th, 1929. Early morning. The water lies smooth as hammered silver, stretching between Switzerland and Germany. The air smells of alpine summer, fresh-cut grass, lake water, the faint sweetness of wildflowers on the distant shore. And there, floating at the dock like something that's escaped from a dream, is the largest aircraft the world has ever seen. It doesn't look like an airplane, not really. It looks like an ocean liner that somehow found its way onto a lake, 3 stories tall, wide as a city street, long as a football field. Its hull gleams in the morning sun, all polished aluminum, catching the light like a mirror. 12 engines sit in a row above the wing, their propellers still, waiting. They called it the Dornier Du X, Claude Dornier's flying ship, Flaggschiff. And in just a few hours, it would attempt something no aircraft had ever done, lift 169 people into the sky. Can you imagine standing on that dock that morning? The smell of the lake, the warmth of the sun on your face. And this thing, impossibly enormous, impossibly ambitious, waiting to prove that the future had arrived. Let me take you aboard. You step onto the sponson, those stubby wing-like platforms that jut from the lower hull, stabilizing the giant on the water. The aluminum is warm under your feet. A uniformed steward stands at the entrance, crisp and formal as any officer on an ocean liner. He nods, smiles, welcomes you to the flying ship. And then you step inside. The first thing that strikes you is how terrestrial it all feels. Not like climbing into an airplane, like walking into a fine hotel, or a first-class railway carriage, or the parlour of a ship bound for New York. The main deck stretches before you, and your eyes take a moment to adjust to the softer light. Wood panelling, upholstered furniture, and underfoot, Persian rugs. Actual Persian rugs, their patterns swirling in deep reds and blues, thick enough to silence your footsteps. The air smells of leather and wool and something else. Fresh paint, perhaps, or the particular scent of newness, that mix of materials and promise that fills any space on its first day. You're standing in the passenger realm now. This entire deck, the middle of 3, belongs to those who've come to fly, and it's arranged just like a ship would be, with spaces flowing one into another, each designed for a different moment in the day. Forward, past a partition, lies the smoking room. Leather armchairs arranged in clusters, small tables, a wet bar tucked against the bulkhead. Yes, a wet bar, stocked and ready, because this is 1929, and flying is still rare enough, glamorous enough, that serving drinks at altitude seems not just acceptable but essential. The chairs are the kind you could spend hours in. Deep seats, arms wide enough to rest a glass on. The leather worn soft, or will be, once enough passengers have settled in with their whiskey and cigars, watching the world slide past below. Amidships, you find the grand dining salon. And here, perhaps more than anywhere else aboard, you understand what Dornier was attempting. This isn't a compartment, it's a room, 30 feet long by some accounts, part of a larger passenger space that stretches nearly 60 feet. Tables draped in white linen. Place settings of custom porcelain, each piece bearing the Dornier name, each piece made specifically for this aircraft. Crystal glasses, real silver. Not the lightweight aluminum cutlery that will become standard on later airlines. Heavy, substantial silver that catches the light and feels solid in your hand. The chairs are upholstered, comfortable. The kind of chairs that encourage you to linger over your meal, to take your time, to enjoy the experience rather than simply consuming fuel for your body. Decorated bulkheads divide the space, panels with ornamental patterns, giving the long room intimacy, breaking it into smaller areas where conversations can flow without feeling exposed to everyone aboard. It's thoughtful, considered. Every detail speaks of a particular vision, that flying could be civilized, comfortable, even luxurious. The light comes through windows, portholes really, in the thick aluminum hull. Not huge, but enough to see out, to watch the ground fall away during takeoff, or to glimpse the endless blue of sky and water during flight. And everywhere, that softness. The Persian rugs absorbing sound, the upholstered furniture, the fabric wall coverings. Later, people will say the rugs were hung on the walls for insulation, for sound dampening. Whether that's precisely true or not, the effect is undeniable. This space doesn't echo, doesn't ring with the metallic harshness you'd expect inside a giant aluminum aircraft. Conversation happens at normal volumes. Silverware on porcelain produces a gentle clink, not a clatter. You move aft, past smaller seating areas, bench seats along the walls, facing each other across a narrow aisle like a railway carriage. For longer flights, these convert to sleeping berths. Curtains would be drawn. Passengers would lie down, perhaps with an extra blanket provided by a steward, and try to sleep as the 12 engines droned overhead. There are writing rooms, small spaces with desks and typewriters where business travellers could work. Because that's what flying meant in 1929. Not vacation usually, but urgency. Business that couldn't wait for a ship. Connections that needed to be made immediately. The lavatories are aft, tucked discreetly away. And beyond them, the galley. The galley is all electric. Remarkably modern for 1929, when most aircraft kitchens, if they existed at all, used alcohol stoves. But here, electric ranges, ovens, refrigeration. Everything needed to prepare proper meals, hot meals, the kind of food you'd expect in a first-class dining room on land or sea. The cooks work in a space designed for efficiency, every surface within arm's reach, storage for provisions, the porcelain stacked and secured. And the smell, when meals are being prepared, bread baking, meat roasting, coffee brewing, drifts through the passenger spaces, promising comfort at altitude. This is what you see on the main deck, the passenger's world. But above you, and below, entire other realms exist. Let's go up. The upper deck is the ship's nerve centre. The bridge, if you will, though they called it the pilot's room, maritime terminology, because Claude Dornier thought in ships, even when he was building aircraft. The cockpit sits forward, with windows wrapping around to provide views in nearly every direction. 2 pilot's seats, control yokes, instruments arranged on panels, altimeters, airspeed indicators, engine gauges. But not for all 12 engines, not here. The pilots have aggregate controls, 1 throttle lever for all 6 port engines, 1 for all 6 starboard, plus an emergency kill switch that can silence all 12 at once if needed. It's a bright space, businesslike. The pilot sits surrounded by sky, watching the horizon, feeling the aircraft through the controls, the gentle feedback of an airship, more than the direct responsiveness of a fighter plane. Behind them, the captain's cabin, a private space for Captain Friedrich Christiansen, large enough for a bunk, a desk, a place to think. And next to it, the navigation room, chart tables, instruments, sextants for celestial navigation, though the Do-X rarely flew high enough or far enough to need them. But the infrastructure was there, The aspiration was there. And then, amidships on this upper deck, you come to something extraordinary, the engine control room. Step inside. The door closes behind you with a solid click. That particular sound of precision engineering, of metal meeting metal, with no gap, no rattle. The room is perhaps 10 feet wide, maybe 12, and stretching across one wall is a panel that stops you cold. 12 throttle levers. 12 complete sets of engine gauges, temperature, oil pressure, RPM, one set for each engine. All of them visible at a glance. All of them requiring constant attention. A man sits here, the flight engineer, the machinist, and his job is to run a power plant in the sky. The smell in this room is different from the passenger spaces below. Here you smell oil, warm metal, the faint bite of fuel fumes seeping up from the nacelles directly above. The engines sit just overhead, 6 pairs of them, each pair mounted in a tandem push-pull arrangement, one propeller facing forward, one aft. And their noise fills this space. Not deafening exactly, but constant. A rumble that you feel in your chest, in your bones, in your teeth. The engineer wears headphones, not for radio communication, for protection. 12 engines at full power produce over 7,000 horsepower, and even through the hull, through the insulation, through the acoustic dampening, that much power makes noise that can damage hearing over time. He watches the gauges, always watching. Temperature climbing on engine 7, the rear-facing pusher on the third nacelle from the left. Of course it's running hot. They all run hot, those rear engines, breathing the exhaust-heated air from the tractors in front of them. But this one's hotter than the others. Oil pressure dropping slightly. He reaches for the throttle, not the big lever the pilots use, but the individual control for this specific engine, and backs it off just a fraction. Half an inch of movement, watching the temperature gauge, watching it hold, watching it slowly begin to drop. 2 minutes later, engine 9 needs attention. Then engine 3. It's constant, juggling 12 temperamental machines, keeping them balanced, keeping them cool, keeping them running. And then the telegraph rings. That's how the captain communicates from the cockpit. An engine order telegraph, the same Chad Burns system that's been used on ships since the 1880s. A brass dial with a handle. Positions marked, full ahead, half ahead, slow ahead, stop. The captain rings from the bridge. A bell sounds in the engine room. The dial swings to a new position, and the engineer responds, adjusting those 12 throttles to match the captain's request. Then he rings his own telegraph handle to confirm. Order received. Engine room complies. It's maritime procedure transplanted to the sky. And it works, because this aircraft is a ship. It thinks like a ship, operates like a ship. The crew aren't just pilots and mechanics, they're officers and engineers and stewards, trained in a tradition that stretches back centuries. The engineer has other responsibilities beyond the throttles. Oil levels, for instance. Each nacelle-mounted tank holds 600 litres, 3,600 litres total across the 6 nacelles. Another 1,300 litres sit in a reserve tank in the hull, and the engineer can pump oil from that reserve to any nacelle that's running low, in flight, while the engines run, keeping them fed, keeping them lubricated, keeping them alive. 3 fuel pump systems provide redundancy. Wind-driven pumps, their small propellers spinning in the slipstream. Electric pumps powered by generators. And hand-operated pumps there if everything else fails. The engineer monitors fuel pressure, watches for any sign that a pump is failing, ready to switch systems instantly. The wing is deep enough that crew can crawl through its internal structure. Access hatches lead from the fuselage out to each nacelle position, 30-foot crawlways through the steel-reinforced duralumin skeleton. Whether actual engine maintenance happened during flight remains debated, but the infrastructure existed. And Maurice Markey, writing for The New Yorker after flying the Do-X in 1931, reported seeing men moving within the hollow wings, maintaining the 12 engines while in flight. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Emergency repairs, perhaps. Adjustments to linkages or controls, nothing major. But the image stays with you. Men crawling through the wing of a flying aircraft, working on machinery that's running at full power, keeping this impossible thing in the air through skill and determination and constant vigilance. Let's go back down to the passenger deck, because this is where the story really happens. This is where people live for however long their flight lasts. Most flights on the DoX were short. Hours, not days. The aircraft's range, limited by its voracious fuel consumption and inability to climb above a few hundred meters, meant it hopped from port to port, refueling constantly. But for those hours, passengers inhabited a world that felt both utterly novel and strangely familiar. Imagine you're aboard for one of the demonstration flights. Maybe the famous one, October 21st, 1929, when 169 people climbed aboard. More people than had ever flown together in a single aircraft. 10 crew members, 159 passengers, plus reporters, photographers, officials, and Dornier employees. The aircraft was so heavy, so marginal, that passengers were asked to move from side to side during turns. The shift of 150 human bodies providing weight redistribution, the control surfaces couldn't quite manage alone. Or imagine one of the longer flights during the transatlantic journey. Not the ocean crossing itself, that was done at 20 feet above the waves, half the crew left behind, flying in ground effect because the engines couldn't lift the aircraft any higher, but one of the coastal hops. Lisbon to Las Palmas, Rio to Suriname, Miami to New York, flights that lasted hours, long enough to eat, to drink, to socialize, to experience what it meant to be aboard this flying ship. You settle into one of the upholstered chairs in the dining salon. The white tablecloth is crisp, fresh. The porcelain plate setting before you bears the Dornier name in elegant script. Real crystal glasses, not plastic, not disposable. Crystal that catches the light and rings when you tap it gently with a fingernail. The steward approaches. He's dressed like an ocean liner steward, white jacket, dark trousers, formal and correct. He knows his job, has likely worked on ships before this, or on the Graf Zeppelin, that other great German prestige project of the era. He places a menu before you. We don't know exactly what those menus said. The details have been lost, though Volker Baer's recent book, Drawing on Swiss Archives, reportedly includes surviving menu cards. But we can guess, based on what we know. This was first-class service, German service. 1929 service, when flying was still rare enough that airlines competed on luxury, not price. Breakfast, if you're on a morning flight, might offer fresh rolls, still warm from the all-electric ovens in the galley aft. Butter, jam. Multiple kinds of jam, probably, because this is how first-class service worked. Eggs prepared however you liked them. Coffee served in silver pots, the steam rising, the smell cutting through the other scents of the cabin. Lunch could be substantial. Cold meats, fresh bread. Soup, perhaps, though serving hot liquids at altitude in any kind of turbulence is a challenge even today. Fruit, cheese, wine. Bavarian beer, quite possibly, given Dornier's origins in Bavaria, though that specific detail remains unverified. But the wet bar was fully stocked. That much we know. Passengers drank aboard, smoked aboard, relaxed aboard. The food isn't revolutionary. It's good, proper. The kind of meal you'd get in a good German hotel or restaurant. But it's the experience that matters. Being served at a properly set table, using real silverware, watching the world outside the windows, sometimes clouds, sometimes coastline, sometimes endless blue, while someone brings you food and drink, and treats you like a passenger on an ocean liner, not a mail sack strapped into a cockpit. The sound, during meals, is a particular kind of music. Conversation, the clink of silver on porcelain, Glasses being set down, laughter sometimes, the rustle of napkins, and beneath it all, always, the steady drone of the 12 engines overhead. Not deafening. The thick Persian rugs and upholstered furniture absorb much of it, but present, constant. A reminder that you're not on a train, not on a ship, but in an aircraft, however much it tries to make you forget. After the meal, you might move to the smoking room, sink into one of those deep leather chairs. Light a cigar? Yes, they allowed smoking aboard, because it's 1929, and the dangers of smoking are still decades from being widely acknowledged. The smoke drifts toward the ceiling, mixing with the smell of leather and alcohol, and 12 piston engines burning fuel. Other passengers join you, and here's where the social world of the flight develops. You talk, share stories, ask where people are travelling, where they're from. What brings them aboard this extraordinary machine? Some passengers are there for business. The DoX represented the cutting edge. Flying aboard was prestigious, newsworthy, a way to be seen as modern and forward-thinking. Others were aviation enthusiasts, wealthy enough to afford the experience and curious enough to want it. A few were famous. Lady Grace Drummond Hay, the British journalist who'd circled the globe aboard the Graf Zeppelin. German actress Antonie Strassmann. Clara Adams, the legendary maiden voyage enthusiast who flew everything first and mailed postcards from everywhere. The Prince of Wales, future King Edward VIII, didn't just fly aboard. He piloted the DoX for 10 minutes during its stop at Calshot, England, in November 1930. Took the controls, felt the massive aircraft respond to his inputs, and presumably returned to the passenger deck afterward, settled into a chair, and accepted a drink like everyone else. What do you talk about in the smoking room? Perhaps the view outside, though at the low altitudes the DoX flew, the view was often just clouds or water or coastline, nothing spectacular. Perhaps the aircraft itself, its size, its ambition, the 12 engines thundering overhead, perhaps politics or business, or family waiting at the destination, or perhaps you don't talk much at all, perhaps you just sit, feel the vibration of the engines through the chair. Watch the light change as the aircraft moves through the sky. Experience the strange, suspended quality of flight, neither here nor there between departure and arrival, existing temporarily in a space that's not quite land and not quite air, but something in between. The air in the cabin is cool. The DoX isn't pressurized, but it rarely flies above 500 meters, 1,600 feet, so cabin pressure remains near ground level. No ear popping, no breathing difficulties, but the temperature varies. Over the ocean, flying low in maritime air, it's cold. You might ask a steward for a blanket. Over Africa, during the tropical legs of the transatlantic journey, the heat inside the aluminum hull becomes oppressive. Passengers loosen collars, open windows when possible, endure. The smell is complex, leather and wool. Whatever food is being prepared in the galley, bread, coffee, meat. The faint bite of engine exhaust seeping in from nacelles just overhead. Aviation fuel, warm oil from 12 Curtiss 5, 12S. And from outside, when you're on the water, the salt smell of harbours. Fresh water at Lake Constance. Sea water everywhere else. If the flight continues into evening, and remember, most don't, the range is too limited, the passenger areas take on a different quality. The stewards pull curtains across the bench seat sections. You change into nightclothes, perhaps, or simply loosen your clothing. Lie down on the converted berth. Pull up the blanket, and try to sleep with 12 engines droning overhead. Some passengers find it soothing, the steady rumble, the gentle vibration like being rocked in a cradle. Others lie awake for hours, aware of every sound, every shift in engine pitch, every moment of turbulence. The crew never sleeps. Can't sleep. The pilots rotate in shifts, but someone is always in the cockpit, hands on the controls. The engineer never leaves his post, 12 engines require constant monitoring. The stewards prepare for the next meal, clean up from the last one, attend to passenger needs whenever summoned. And below, in the lowest deck, the one passengers never see, the fuel sloshes in 8 large tanks. Provisions are stored, equipment is secured. The 9 watertight compartments that keep the giant afloat on water remain ready, sealed, protecting the flying ship from the consequences of a bad landing. But let's focus on the crew a bit more, because they're the ones who made all of this possible. They're the ones who turned Dornier's vision into something that actually flew. Captain Friedrich Christiansen commanded the transatlantic demonstration flight. Born in 1879, 50 years old when the Do-X first flew, he embodied a peculiar intersection of eras. His father had been a sea captain. Young Friedrich joined the merchant marine at 16, learned navigation by the stars, served as second officer on the Preußen, then the largest sailing ship in the world. But when World War I came, Christiansen became a seaplane pilot, scored 13 victories in aerial combat, received the Pour le Mérite, the Blue Max, one of Imperial Germany's highest military decorations, then, after the war, returned to the sea, commanded merchant ships again, was working as a ship's captain when Dornier hired him in 1929. Can you imagine a better commander for a flying ship? A man who'd spent decades at sea and in the air, who understood maritime tradition and aviation innovation, who could think like a ship captain and fly like a pilot. He was, by all accounts, serious, competent, not given to unnecessary risk, which was probably wise, given what he was commanding. The Do-X required respect, demanded careful handling. Push it too hard, try to climb too steeply, turn too aggressively, and it would remind you, sometimes violently, that it was operating at the very edge of what physics allowed. Chief Test Pilot Richard Wagner flew the maiden flight on July 12, 1929. Wagner was an experienced pilot, familiar with Dornier's earlier flying boats. But even he must have felt something extraordinary climbing into the cockpit that morning. No one had ever attempted to fly something this large, this heavy, this ambitious. The crew included navigators, radio operators, additional pilots, and stewards, men trained in the traditions of ocean liner service, who knew how to set a table properly, how to serve wine without spilling, how to anticipate what passengers needed before they asked. They wore uniforms, maintained standards, created the illusion that flying at 170 kilometers per hour in an aluminum hull held aloft by 12 screaming engines was no different from sailing across the Atlantic on the SS Bremen. But it was the engineer who had the hardest job, the one we should probably admire most. Think about what he did. Sat in that engine control room for hours, eyes always moving, gauges to gauges to gauges, 12 engines, each with its own personality, its own quirks. Engine 7 always runs hot. Engine 3 drinks oil faster than the others. Engine 9's temperature gauge reads 10 degrees high. You have to remember that. Adjust mentally every time you check it. The telegraph rings. The captain wants more power. The engineer pushes the throttles forward, not all at once, not equally, but in a sequence he's learned through experience. Engines 1 and 12 first, the outermost pair, then 2 and 11. Working inward, keeping the thrust balanced so the aircraft doesn't yaw. Temperature begins climbing. He watches, waits, sees engine 7 approaching the danger zone, backs it off half an inch, advances engine 8 to compensate, keeps the total thrust where the captain wants it, while protecting the machinery from destroying itself. It's a constant dance, a conversation with 12 machines that never ends. When you're in that control room, you can't look away, can't relax, because the moment you do, the moment your attention wavers, something will go wrong. A temperature will spike, a pressure will drop, and if you don't catch it immediately, an engine will fail, maybe just shut down, maybe seize, maybe catch fire. And if one engine fails, the other 11 have to work harder, which means they run hotter, which increases the chance of another failure, and another. until the whole carefully balanced system begins to collapse. The engineer prevents this every hour, every flight, with vigilance and skill and an almost supernatural awareness of what 12 piston engines sound like when they're happy and what they sound like when they're not. The crew worked as a team. Had to. The Do-X couldn't be flown by one person, or two, or even three. It required 10 to 14 people, each handling their part of the operation, trusting everyone else to handle theirs. Maritime discipline, maritime hierarchy, maritime standards of precision and communication. And like any ship's company, they developed their own culture, their own jokes, their own ways of handling the stress and the responsibility and the knowledge that they were doing something no one had ever done before. They were making history, whether they fully understood that or not. Now let me tell you about a journey that was supposed to take weeks and ended up taking 10 months. November 3rd, 1930. The Do-X lifts off from Lake Constance, bound for America. Captain Christensen at the controls. 14 crew members aboard. The plan is straightforward. Fly west through Europe, down the African coast, across the Atlantic to South America, then north to New York. A demonstration flight, a publicity tour, proof that this enormous flying ship could cross an ocean and open a new era of air travel. It didn't quite work out that way. The route took them first through the Netherlands, then England, where they landed at Calshot near Southampton. The Prince of Wales came aboard, flew the aircraft for 10 minutes, took the actual controls, felt that massive machine respond to his touch. Can you imagine being the Prince, sitting in the cockpit of the largest aircraft ever built, watching the English coast slide past below? Then France, Spain, Portugal, everything going more or less according to plan, until Lisbon. November 29th, 1930. The Do-X floating in Lisbon harbour. Some kind of maintenance work underway. A tarpaulin, canvas probably, used to cover equipment or protect something from the weather, makes contact with a hot exhaust pipe. Fire. It spreads quickly. Canvas burns fast, and there are 12 engine nacelles overhead, fuel lines running everywhere, oil tanks holding thousands of litres. The crew fights the fire, manages to contain it, but by the time it's out, most of the left wing is destroyed, the fabric covering burned away, the underlying structure damaged. The Do-X isn't going anywhere. 6 weeks they sat in Lisbon, waiting for new parts to be fabricated in Germany, waiting for them to be shipped, waiting for repairs, the schedule torn to pieces, the publicity tour becoming something else, an epic of endurance perhaps, or a cautionary tale about ambition meeting reality. When they finally departed in January 1931, the real challenges began. Las Palmas in the Canary Islands. A takeoff attempt in heavy seas. The Do-X pounds into the waves. These aren't gentle lake swells. These are Atlantic rollers, lifting and dropping the huge aircraft, slamming the hull down again and again. Something breaks. The hull is damaged. Another delay. More repairs. Another month lost. Then south to Portuguese Guinea, to Balama. And here, physics delivered its verdict. The air at Balama is hot, humid, dense with moisture, and hot, humid air is less dense than cool, dry air, provides less lift. The Do-X's engines, already struggling to lift the aircraft above 1,600 feet in ideal conditions, couldn't generate enough power in tropical air to break free of the water's surface. They tried, ran the engines up to full power. 12 Curtiss 5, 12 SN screaming, the aircraft accelerating across the water, spray flying, hull pounding, everything shaking, but it wouldn't lift, wouldn't break free, just skipped and bounced and ploughed through the water until they had to throttle back and try again. How many attempts? How many days? The records don't say precisely, but eventually they had to accept reality. Offload weight. Leave half the crew behind. 9 men sent home by ship. Leave most of the mail cargo. Strip everything unnecessary and try again. They didn't reach the Cape Verde Islands until June 5th, 1931. 7 months after leaving Germany. 7 months to travel a route that should have taken weeks. And then came the Atlantic crossing itself. Cape Verde to Natal, Brazil. 2,000 miles of open ocean, the longest overwater flight the DO-X would ever attempt. And they did it at an altitude of approximately 6 meters, 20 feet. Think about that for a moment. 20 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. So low that passengers looking out the windows could see individual waves, could see whitecaps, could probably count the seconds between swells if they wanted to. Why so low? Ground effect. When an aircraft flies close to a surface, water, land, doesn't matter. The air trapped beneath the wings creates a cushion, increases lift, reduces drag. It's a real phenomenon, understood and used by pilots even in 1929. And for the DO-X, unable to climb to a safe altitude with its full fuel load, ground effect was the only way to make it across. So they skimmed, surfed the boundary between air and water, praying that no rogue wave would rise up and strike the hull, praying the engines would keep running, praying that wind and weather would cooperate, because at 20 feet there's no room for error, no margin for mistakes. Britannica confirms it. The DO-X achieved a considerable gain in performance during an Atlantic crossing when it flew close to the sea surface. That's academic language, for they barely made it. The crew who stayed aboard, 10 men now, down from the original 14, must have spent that entire flight on edge, watching, listening. The pilot's eyes never leaving the horizon and the instruments. The engineer monitoring his gauges even more obsessively than usual. Everyone aware that one engine failure, one miscalculation, one moment of inattention could end everything. But they made it. Natal, Brazil, solid ground, or solid water at least. The DO-X settles onto the harbour, and the remaining crew must have felt something close to euphoria, relief, triumph, the knowledge that they'd just done something extraordinary. The local German émigré communities greeted them as heroes, because that's what they were, heroes of a particular kind, not warriors, not explorers in the traditional sense, but men who'd pushed a marginal aircraft across an ocean through skill and determination and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. From Natal, the journey became easier, relatively speaking. Rio de Janeiro. Arriving around June 20th, 1931. 8 months after leaving Germany. The DO-X floating in Rio's harbour, and you can imagine how it looked to Brazilians who'd never seen anything like it. This giant aluminum flying ship, bigger than any aircraft they'd known existed, sitting on the water like a visitation from the future. Then north, Suriname, Trinidad, San Juan, working their way up the Caribbean, hopping from port to port, the DO-X behaving better now that it was back over warm but less punishing air, flying shorter distances, able to land and refuel frequently. Miami on August 22nd, 1931. American soil or American water. Close enough. And then on August 27th, 1931, nearly 10 months after leaving Germany, the DO-X flew into New York Harbor. A ticker-tape welcome at the Battery. Thousands of people lining the streets. Not quite the parade reserved for Lindbergh after his solo Atlantic crossing in 1927, but significant, enthusiastic. New Yorkers appreciating the sheer audacity of what they were seeing. An aircraft that could carry more than 150 people, flying into their harbour, landing on the water like it had every right to be there. The DO-X spent 9 months in New York. Berthed at Glenn Curtis Airport, which would later become LaGuardia. Complete engine overhauls, maintenance, repairs from the long journey. And it became a tourist attraction. Thousands of people made pilgrimages to see it, paid for sightseeing flights around New York Harbor, climbed aboard, walked through the passenger spaces, touched the Persian rugs, sat in the dining salon chairs, and marvelled. Maurice Marquis of the New Yorker flew aboard with 71 other passengers, wrote about it afterward, described the underside of the wing looking like the roof of some factory building lifted off to serve a new fantastic purpose. That's exactly right. The Do-X looked industrial, mechanical, nothing sleek or aerodynamic about it. Just massive, functional, determined to fly through brute force and engineering. Clara Adams flew from Rio to New York, the only woman on that leg of the journey. She was a legendary figure in early aviation, a wealthy woman who made a hobby of being first. First flight of new routes, first on new aircraft, collecting maiden voyage experiences like others collected stamps. She mailed more than 6 pounds of letters and postcards during the journey, each one postmarked from the Do-X's onboard post office. That mail is collector's items now. People pay hundreds of dollars for a postcard Clara Adams sent from the flying ship. The crew reportedly received an audience at the White House. President Herbert Hoover shaking hands with Captain Christensen and his men, acknowledging what they'd accomplished. This was August 1931. The Depression 2 years old and deepening. Unemployment climbing, the country struggling. But for a moment, the president could welcome these German aviators who'd crossed an ocean in a flying ship, and everyone could pretend the future was still full of possibility. The return journey was different, faster. 3 days. May 21st, 1932. The Do-X departed New York via Newfoundland and the Azores, the reverse of Lindbergh's route. And on May 24th, it landed on Lake Mugglesea near Berlin. 200,000 people came to watch. 200,000. Standing on the shore, crowding the docks, packing every vantage point, the largest crowd to greet an aircraft in German history. The Do-X taxied to shore past the excursion restaurant Rubertsaal. You can still find that restaurant today, still on the lake, though the world has changed around it. Captain Christensen shut down the 12 engines, opened the door, and stepped out to cheering that must have felt surreal after 10 months of struggle. They'd done it, proven it was possible. Crossed the Atlantic, both directions, in an aircraft that most people had said would never fly at all. A tour followed. 24 German and European cities. The Do-X, moving from lake to lake, harbour to harbour, landing and floating and letting people come aboard. More than 1 million viewers over the course of that tour. 1 million people who saw the flying ship with their own eyes, walked through its passenger spaces, understood viscerally that aviation had changed, that the future Dornier envisioned might actually arrive. The tour ended November 2nd, 1932, back on Lake Zurich, near where it had all begun. The Do-X settling onto Swiss water, the engines shutting down one last time after a triumphant journey. And then, nothing. The Do-X never entered commercial service, never sold a ticket to a regular passenger, never flew a scheduled route. The economics were brutal and inescapable. 14 crew members, 12 fuel-guzzling engines burning 400 gallons per hour. For 66 passengers and minimal cargo, the useful load fraction, the percentage of takeoff weight that could be passengers and freight rather than aircraft and fuel, was only 27%. Contemporary aircraft managed 35 to 42%. A commercial operation with a 14-man crew, 12 gas-guzzling engines for only 66 passengers and little additional payload does not pay off. That's how Volker Baer's definitive book puts it. Blunt, accurate, undeniable. The Great Depression destroyed the luxury travel market Dornier had hoped to capture. In 1929, when the Do-X first flew, wealthy people still believed their wealth was secure. By 1932, they knew better. The market for expensive, prestigious air travel had evaporated, and the Do-X, built for that market, had nowhere to go. Deutsche Lufthansa took possession when Dornier went bankrupt, used it for a brief tour, and then, in 1933, disaster. 9 days into a planned tour to Vienna and Istanbul, the Do-X was making a landing on a reservoir lake near Passau. The approach was too steep, the touchdown too hard, and the entire tail section tore off, just separated from the aircraft, the largest structural failure you can imagine. The accident was successfully covered up, kept quiet. The Do-X was dismantled, shipped to Berlin in pieces, and reassembled as a static display in the Deutsche Luftfahrtsammlung at Lehrter Bahnhof, the German aviation collection. A museum piece at age 4. It sat there for 10 years. Visitors walked around it, marvelling at its size, reading plaques about its accomplishments. Children pressed their faces to windows, looking into the dining salon. Adults remembered the excitement of 1929, when it had seemed like anything was possible. November 23rd to 24th, 1943. RAF bombing raid. 383 aircraft struck Berlin that night. The museum was hit. Fire swept through the building, and the Do-X burned. What remained after the fire was scavenged by post-war Berliners desperate for materials. Aluminum was valuable, could be melted down, reformed, used for anything. The giant flying ship became pots and pans and building materials and things no one remembers now. The Italian variants, Do-X2 and Do-X3, built for the Italian Air Force, met similar fates. Do-X2 suffered an identical tail failure in 1933, just 1 month after the German original's accident. Both Italian aircraft were scrapped in 1937. Too expensive to maintain, too impractical to use. Beautiful dinosaurs in a world that had moved on. No Do-X survives today, not one. Fragments of the torn-off tail section are displayed at the Dornier Museum in Friedrichshafen. A few metal scraps sit in the German Museum of Technology in Berlin, but that's all. The rest is gone. A volunteer group has spent more than a decade reconstructing the aircraft digitally from photographs and fragmentary drawings. 112 university students contributing 33,600 hours of work. Their goal? A full-scale, non-flying but buoyant replica by 2029. The centenary of the maiden flight. We'll see if they make it, but let me take you back one more time. Before the fires and the failures, before the economics doomed it. Back to when it flew. Because despite everything, despite its inability to climb, despite the fires and delays, despite burning 400 gallons per hour to carry 66 people, there was something magical about the Do-X. It was the absurdity of it, perhaps. The sheer audacity. 12 engines, 3 decks, Persian rugs and dining salons and a wet bar at altitude. The engine order telegraph ringing in the control room, while passengers below sipped Bavarian beer and never quite believed they were flying. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just the dream made visible. Claude Dornier had imagined something, that flying could be comfortable, civilized, that you could cross an ocean by air with the same dignity and grace you'd cross it by sea. That aircraft didn't have to be cramped metal tubes that rattled your teeth loose and left you deaf for days afterward. The Do-X proved he was right. Someday, just not yet. The engines weren't powerful enough. The materials weren't light enough. The fuel wasn't efficient enough. The runways didn't exist. A dozen technological problems stood between Dornier's vision and its realization, and solving them would take another 30 years. But he saw it. In 1924, when he started planning the Flaggschiff, he saw what air travel could become. And he built it anyway. Built it knowing it was too soon, too ambitious, too expensive. Built it because he believed the future would catch up to his imagination. And it did. The Boeing 747, introduced in 1970, has a wingspan within feet of the Do-X's. The Airbus A380, which flew in 2005, brought back the 3-deck concept, upper deck, main deck, lower deck, just like Dornier planned. Modern aircraft use sponson-like designs for stability. All metal construction is universal. Dornier's vision was correct. His timing was simply 40 years early. The flying boat era itself died during World War II. The war produced hundreds of concrete runways worldwide, built for bombers but usable by any aircraft. Built thousands of four-engine land-based planes that could cross oceans without touching water. Pan American's Boeing 314 Clippers flew their last scheduled routes in April 1946. The jet age, the de Havilland Comet in 1952, the Boeing 707 in 1958, made everything that came before seem slow and quaint and hopelessly obsolete. The last gasps came in the late 1940s and early 50s. Howard Hughes's H-4, Hercules, the spruce goose, flew once in 1947, carrying Hughes and a small crew, proving that an aircraft even larger than the Do-X could fly. Barely. The Saunders Roe Princess, a British flying boat, first flew in 1952. Both were commercial failures. The world had moved on. Water landings still happen, of course. Float planes in Alaska and Canada and Scandinavia, tourist seaplanes, but not as mainline commercial transport, not as the backbone of international aviation. That era passed, and with it passed something else. A particular approach to flight, a philosophy that said flying should feel like sailing, that passengers deserved space and comfort and dining salons. That crew should wear uniforms and maintain standards and operate with maritime precision. Maybe we lost something when that ended. Maybe we gained something. I'm not here to tell you which is true, but I'll tell you this. I wish I could have flown aboard the Do-X just once. Settled into one of those upholstered chairs in the dining salon, felt the 12 engines rumbling overhead, looked out the window at 20 feet of altitude and seen the Atlantic waves passing below. Eaten from that custom Dornier porcelain. Felt the Persian rugs underfoot. Walked forward to the smoking room and sat with other passengers sharing stories while the flying ship carried us between worlds. It must have felt like living in the future, even if that future arrived too soon and couldn't quite sustain itself. Even if the engines ran hot and the range was limited, and the whole enterprise was held together by engineering brilliance and the determination of men like Captain Christiansen and his engineer, watching gauges hour after hour, keeping 12 temperamental machines running through skill and vigilance. They made it work for a little while, and that's worth something. There's a photograph I've seen, one of many that survived in the Bundesarchiv, in the Library of Congress, in private collections. It shows the dining salon, white tablecloths, place settings, upholstered chairs, light coming through the portholes, and it looks comfortable, civilized, like somewhere you'd want to be. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the specifications or the records or the technical achievements, though those matter, but that feeling of civilized possibility. The idea that flying could be an experience rather than an ordeal, that it could be something you looked forward to rather than endured. The Do-X existed for such a short time. First flight, July 12th, 1929. Last commercial tour ending November 1932. 3 years, then another 11 as a museum piece, then gone. But in those 3 years, 169 people flew together in a single aircraft. Thousands more flew during the tours and demonstrations. Clara Adams mailed her postcards. The Prince of Wales took the controls. Passengers dined on custom porcelain and drank from crystal glasses and walked on Persian rugs while flying over the Atlantic at 20 feet. It happened. It was real. And the people who experienced it remembered it for the rest of their lives. The volunteer group, reconstructing the Do-X digitally, they're not just preserving technical drawings, they're preserving a dream. A moment in history when someone believed air travel could be magnificent. When someone built a flying ship because the name meant something, because Flugschiff implied dignity and purpose, and the fusion of two great traditions, aviation and maritime service. By 2029, if they succeed, there will be a full-scale replica, non-flying but buoyant, floating on water somewhere in Germany, probably Lake Constance, where the original first touched the sky, and people will be able to walk through it, see the dining salon, stand in the engine control room before those 12 throttle levers, sit in the cockpit where Captain Christensen commanded his flying ship. It won't fly, can't fly. The original barely could, but it will help us remember. And sometimes that's enough. One more thing, Captain Friedrich Christensen, the man who commanded the transatlantic flight, lived until 1972, 43 years after first flying the Doe X. Long enough to see the jet age arrive and mature. Long enough to see the Boeing 747 begin flying routes the Doe X had only dreamed of. Long enough to watch the future he'd helped imagine become reality. His later history is complicated, troubling. He joined the Nazi Party, commanded German forces in the occupied Netherlands during World War II, was convicted of war crimes in 1948 for a reprisal raid that killed civilians, served time in prison. I tell you this not to tarnish what he accomplished, but because it's true. People are complicated. Heroes in one moment can make terrible choices in others. The man who successfully commanded the largest aircraft ever built across the Atlantic also participated in atrocities a decade later. History doesn't let us keep the parts we like and discard the parts we don't. We take it whole. We acknowledge complexity. We honour achievement while recognising failure. We remember both the dining salon and the war crimes, the Persian rugs and the reprisal raids. The Doe X was built by people. Imperfect, complicated, ambitious people. Some of them did extraordinary things. Some of them did terrible things. Often they were the same people. And maybe that's the real story. Not that we once built a flying ship that could barely fly, but that we tried. That human beings, with all our flaws and contradictions and impossible dreams, looked at the sky and said, I think we could put a dining salon up there. I think we could serve dinner on real china while 12 engines roar overhead. I think we could make flying feel like sailing. And for a brief moment, 3 years, 10 months of which were spent crossing the Atlantic, they were right. The Doe X flew. Despite everything, despite physics and economics and the Great Depression and engines that ran too hot and a range too short and takeoff weight too heavy, it flew. And 66 passengers at a time flew with it, walking on Persian rugs a mile above the earth or 20 feet above the ocean, experiencing something no one had experienced before. That's what I want you to remember, not the failures, not the accidents, not even the triumph of the transatlantic crossing. Impressive as that was, remember the dining salon, the white tablecloths, the custom porcelain, the wet bar in the smoking room, the engineer watching his 12 sets of gauges, making tiny adjustments, keeping the machinery alive through skill and devotion. The passengers looking out the windows and seeing the world from a perspective humans had held for less than 30 years. Remember that someone tried, someone dreamed, someone believed flying could be magnificent. And for a little while, it was.